your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Hello, I'm Naveen Day. Thanks for joining us for a look back at what made headlines in Alberta this week. The United Way of Lethbridge and Southwestern Alberta will be hosting their first annual Pull the Bus campaign next month. Residents will team up in groups of 8 and work together to pull a city transit bus to raise money for various organizations. The executive director for United Way, Jackie Zalesik, says a lot of organizations have been struggling financially throughout the year, so this campaign is a great way to show their support.
We've seen a lot of events cancel or being postponed. And so this is really United Way stepping up to pull together as a community and help support different agencies throughout different communities. Being able to raise funds, as United Way does support different agencies in the human services fields to raise money to support the programs that are vital and needed most throughout our communities.
The Pull the Bus event takes place on September 11th at Festival Square. Tourism Lethbridge has partnered with the Downtown BRZ to officially launch a new initiative. The initiative is called Sip, Taste, Explore, a Southern Alberta adventure, and it's all about promoting agri-food tourism and businesses. Aaron Crane, the CEO for Tourism Lethbridge, explains the importance of campaigns like this one.
One of the great things about tourism is that it is really led by residents and getting people out from the community into those tourist places, teaching people to be a tourist in your own backyard. That's just as important as those big events that we always host. And we know that what's important to visitors is what's important to residents. So when you like something and you tell your friends about it, that's the economic value that we want to see here in the city.
More information can be found on the Tourism Lethbridge website. A well-known pastor and his wife, who lost their home in a devastating fire a couple of years ago, are embarking on a new adventure in Winnipeg. The couple has left their mark on the community after joining the Lethbridge Salvation Army 5 years ago. They have both been in ministry for over 20 years now. Video journalist Micah Quinn caught up with Don in Winnipeg to chat about his time in Lethbridge and what's next for him and his wife.
I wish I could say that it was a decision. It was more of a matter of being appointed and coming into agreement with the appointment.
Bladen says he will be in charge of overlooking 15 communities in his new role as area commander in Winnipeg. He told us he'll miss the people in Lethbridge and the incredible memories that were made.
The opening of our thrift store, the marriage of a young couple in our church, and different gatherings that we had at Henderson Lake or down by the river, or going down to Waterton. There's any number of things I could talk about, and we could take a long time.
Unfortunately, not everything was smooth sailing for the couple. Back in 2020, their home was destroyed by fire, leaving nothing but a massive pile of rubble. Bladen says he credits his faith in God as a huge help following the tragedy.
It was a horrible thing. We lost everything, really. When we visited the house a couple of days after the fact and, all the rubble was cleared away, I was just looking at a hole in the ground.
As you may know, Bridge City News is part of Miracle Channel, and last fall we sadly lost the man at the top of our organization. Leon Fontaine passed away suddenly in November, and since then, the Miracle Channel Board of Directors has undergone the very difficult task of finding the next person who could take over the work Leon has started. Well, this week the board announced the next person to carry the torch, and he may be a familiar face to some of you. He's appeared on Return to Reason, one of Miracle Channel's programs. He's also a pastor and a son-in-law of the late, great Leon Fontaine. Jeremy Press says the time he spent with Fontaine was like attending a master class on how to navigate through storms.
In seasons, as we just walked through, we went through COVID. And as you can imagine, there's incredible trials that comes with that, when a lot of the time, non-for-profits finances are donor-based, right? And so in a season of time when the economy is so uncertain and people's very jobs are at risk, you can imagine non-for-profits are also at complete risk. And so to watch him walk that out with wisdom and grace was a masterclass. And I was able to do that, not only just that, but I just mean over the last 2 decades, watch him walk out every day, wisdom, day in and day out, and just continually glean from anything that he could teach me.
That was Jeremy Press, the new CEO of Miracle Channel. Looking forward to working with him. And when we return from the break, stories from around Alberta that made headlines this week, including the many communities that have opened their doors to those displaced due to the raging fires in the Northwest Territories. Welcome back. Thousands of Northwest Territories residents have been forced out of their homes by some of the hundreds of wildfires torching the boreal forest. Evacuees who arrived safely in Alberta after fleeing the area are recounting harrowing tales of driving through flame-covered highways. One evacuee described the community of Enterprise as, quote, gone pretty much, saying signs couldn't even be read because they were melted.
The town was gone pretty much. There was no buildings left. It was just metal frames melted. There were signs. You couldn't even read the signs because they were, when the fire blew through there, they were all melted. Everything was gone. It was like devastation. Trees were like ashes. Everything was like ashes and on fire.
The only way we could drive is I seen the white line there. I said, look, I'm going to guide you with the white line. So I said, if I say white line, you come towards me. If I say I can't see you, you're going too far that other way. So that's how we got out of there, just watching the white line and saying, you're doing good. Go to the white line. You go back. I hope I never have to go through this in my life again. I'll have all white hair.
The highways in and out of the Northwest Territories and northern Alberta are used as an escape from disasters such as these wildfires. So what happens if the roads get backed up or blocked off? Alberta's Transportation and Economic Corridors Minister Devin Dreeshen says the province has plans to build more roads.
Earlier this spring, when Alberta was faced with a very severe wildfire season, actually the worst on record, we looked at these issues because with the remote communities, especially in northern communities, they really just have, in a lot of cases, one point of safety, one point of access to get out. So looking at building in more safety egress or more additional roads for them to be able to travel on is a priority, and that's why we actually started the work on Highway 686, which essentially would connect Fort McMurray all the way across to Peerless Lake and essentially off to Grand Prairie, giving folks in Fort McMurray a secondary access point out of Fort Mac, not just Highway 63, as well as all the communities across northern Alberta to be able to have another point of safety to be able to escape in the event of wildfires.
Alberta's opposition NDP critic for energy and climate says the Premier of Alberta deliberately sabotaged a booming sector of the province's economy by issuing a moratorium on wind and solar projects. During a press conference on Tuesday, NDP's Kathleen Ganley went on to say Danielle Smith did not consult with or give notice to those in the energy sector prior to halting production, and that Smith lied about writing to the Alberta Utilities Commission requesting the 6-month halt.
That isn't true. The letter she referenced says no such thing. The letter says, quote, effective resolution necessarily requires a dedicated period of engagement with all stakeholders identified above, followed by government direction. Governments routinely do engagement and regulatory reviews. They do so without shutting down an entire industry. The letter does not request a halt or a pause or a moratorium. This is immediately obvious to anyone who has read it.
We reached out to Alberta's Minister of Affordability and Utilities, Nathan Neudorf, for response to Ganley's attack, but he could not be reached by airtime. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says last week's announcement by Canada's Energy Minister about Ottawa's proposed clean energy regulations was disappointing and unconstitutional and would crush the finances of Canadians. But she says her United Conservative Party agrees with the broader goal of decreasing the electricity grid and getting to carbon neutrality.
We have a plan to get there by 2050. It's our emissions reduction and energy development plan. But a 2035 target is not attainable. We have to make sure that we are bringing energy onto the grid in a reliable way. We cannot build our Alberta power grid on intermittent power. Other provinces that have managed to get to closer to a net zero power grid already have baseload power, hydroelectric power, nuclear power. We cannot have intermittent power. I looked at the amount of capacity versus the amount of generation from solar in 2022, 13%. I looked at the amount of wind capacity relative to generation in 2022, 33%. If wind only works 33% of the time and solar only works 13% of the time, we need to bring on more baseload power to make sure that we don't have rolling blackouts. That is the bottom line. We want wind and solar to come on in a responsible way, but we have to make sure that we have enough baseload power to ensure reliability.
And when it comes to the federal government's 2035 deadline to reach climate targets, Alberta legislative reporter Tyler Dawson says there's not just a disagreement between the provinces, but also a disagreement of the parties. His interview with Jeanette Rocher is coming right up. There's some disagreement on whether or not Alberta can reach new clean electricity targets set by the federal government. The UCP says Alberta cannot reach that 2035 deadline and that a target date of 2050 is more likely. But the NDP says we can reach that federal deadline. Our legislative reporter and Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, sat down with BCN's Jeanette Rocher to weigh in. Have a look.
The bulk of our electricity generation comes from natural gas. There are still a couple coal-fired electricity plants, but primarily we're talking natural gas. And Alberta is not particularly well integrated into the sort of broader electricity market. So, one of the ways that we could lower our emissions intensity would be to get involved in the BC electricity market, maybe buy some of our electricity from BC, which would be hydro, which would be, lower emissions. So basically what the UCP are saying is, look, this just isn't possible. So much of this is natural gas. This would require colossal investments in carbon capture and sequestration. This would require massive investments in wind and solar, perhaps some small nuclear reactor stuff. So the costs here are going to be fairly substantial, and the UCP says, look, it's just not possible. Now, the NDP say that it is possible, and it potentially is. It just would require a lot of money. But the interesting thing on the NDP front is the Alberta NDP says it's possible. The Saskatchewan NDP says it isn't, and of course the federal NDP is a bit wishy-washy on it. So it's a sort of an interesting political question where there's not a whole lot of agreement within the New Democrats about whether or not this is feasible. And certainly this is shaping up to be something that Danielle Smith is going to fight with Ottawa over.
Tyler, do you think that we could see that Sovereignty Act enacted, especially since Alberta has long fought back legally against federal rules that it doesn't like, and it also has passed that Sovereignty Act? So could we see it come into play here?
I think we could. I think probably the first step in this process on the clean electricity regulations is some sort of constitutional fight. Alberta did this with Bill C-69 that created the Impact Assessment Act and the Impact Assessment Agency federally. We did this on the carbon tax. In neither case was Alberta's legal argument persuasive to the courts. But certainly there is the jurisdictional question here of whether or not Ottawa can sort of create these new regulations on provincial electricity systems. So I certainly think we're going to see a legal fight. Whether or not that will be successful is another question. And then, I do suspect that we'll certainly hear some Sovereignty Act talk. Whether or not they go ahead and use it is maybe a different question. And of course, the overarching question is, what would that actually do? What can the Alberta government do with the Sovereignty Act that would prevent these rules from coming into place? And I think that's probably something that the UCP's strategists are looking at right now, because I don't think it's super clear on its face what they would do.
Okay, so still on the energy file here, the Alberta government has initiated a 6-month pause on the approval of renewable energy projects, but Premier Danielle Smith hasn't been entirely clear why that happened. So Tyler, do you have any ideas?
No, it's sort of anyone's guess. At this point, she was asked why this moratorium was announced and said that, Alberta had been asked by the Alberta Utilities. Oh, I'm blanking on what it's called, but they're the body that approves projects.
The commission?
Yes, the Alberta Utilities Commission. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what she said, that they had asked for a pause, and that also the Alberta Electricity Systems Operator had asked for a pause. And she pointed out these 2 letters that had been sent to the government, but neither of them asked for this moratorium. So bit confusing there what's going on. You know, what we do know is certainly that her rural constituency and some of the rural municipalities are a little bit concerned about this in terms of the effect on the landscape, the effect of sort of land reclamation once these projects reach end of life, that sort of thing. So a bit unclear, you know, the sort of immediate cause, but certainly there are some concerns in that rural constituency. And this basically just looks like a 6-month pause on any new project approvals. The issue that is arising is that the renewable energy sector sort of says they weren't consulted on it. You know, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I think there's something like 90 projects in the pipeline right now. So it's certainly injected a little bit of uncertainty into that sector, which is, you know, a booming sector for Alberta. So there's conspiracy theories floating around that this is, you know, a way to help oil and gas and destroy the green energy sector. But the government sort of insists that this is just taking a little bit of time to get it right.
The war of words isn't just between Alberta Premier Smith and the opposition NDP. She's also taken up battle with the Trudeau's Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault. Jeanette Rocher will return to the desk shortly with our political reporter, Brian Lilly. He will explain why fighting between the provinces and the federal government over clean energy targets could get messy. Stay with us. There's been quite a war of words between Premier Daniel Smith and Trudeau's Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault over his plan for a clean electricity grid. Smith even had some evocative and choice words for the feds, even going as far as saying, quote, "We're going to tell the federal government to go pound sand." Earlier this week, political reporter for the Toronto Sun, Brian Lilly, sat down with Jeanette Rocher to break it down.
Alberta is trying to change its electricity grid. We all know that. There's been a big move on solar, a big drop in the amount of coal, increase in natural gas, which is a cleaner burning fossil fuel. So all these things happening, and yeah, there's a pause right now on new wind and solar projects, but that makes sense given the reasons that Premier Smith has put forward. But she's not unwilling to work to say, you know what, we still need power, but we need to do it in a more environmentally sustainable way. Stephen Guilbeault, you will note, made this announcement in Toronto. He made it in Ontario, steps from where I'm sitting now. And Ontario is one of the provinces that has one of the cleanest grids going. You keep hearing the statistics. 85% of Canada's electrical grid is green or renewable or some type of clean fuel. In Ontario, it's about 50% nuclear. And then we've got a large, hydroelectricity. You guys don't have that. You do not have hydroelectricity capacity the way we do in Eastern Canada or in British Columbia. Neither does Saskatchewan. So they want to get that extra 15% to be clean, but that's 15% is disproportionately in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And rather than working with those 2 provinces, with those premiers, he's going around poking them in the eye. Electricity generation is clearly a provincial responsibility. I mentioned earlier Scott Moe's comment of come and arrest me. Yeah. That may end up happening because one of the ways they're looking at doing this so that it is the federal government can claim jurisdiction is using the criminal code to make it illegal to use these fossil fuels that they want to get rid of or use them without carbon capture and storage. And at that point, the courts would have to balance between the constitutional right of all provinces to generate electricity how they see fit versus the federal government using another head of power to claim precedence over that. It could get very messy, and there's no reason for it to get messy. But this is Stephen Guilbeault. He has a religion and he wants to convert you to it. And it's the green religion, and he will accept no heresy.
Oh, wow, that sounds, yeah, it sounds like it could get ugly there. Okay, so speaking of Premier Smith, so there's been constant pressure on her to blame the province's wildfire season on climate change. And so her, now her comments that they're mostly human caused are considered controversial. So what's behind this, Brian?
What's behind it is, unfortunately, a lot of politics. The Trudeau Liberals love to play up that everything that happens that's bad is climate change. And then if you say otherwise, then they campaign against you, especially if you're from Alberta and a conservative, then, well, you're just a climate change denier, and they use wedge politics. It's also a lot of people in the media who are too lazy or too ignorant to bother looking. Alberta has some of the best stats on wildfires in the country. And you look at British Columbia is pretty good as well. And I've said on this program before, you look at what causes the forest fires in different parts of the country, and it differs on the part of the country. In British Columbia, it is more likely to be a lightning strike than human cause. In Alberta, it's more likely to be human cause. That doesn't necessarily mean arson. It often means people out camping, or if you go through the stats in Alberta, as I've done, you'll find cause of fire, hot exhaust from ATV, people going out in the bush with their ATV when things are dry, when there's a fire ban on. And I wouldn't automatically think of that. I wouldn't, I'd respect a fire ban and say, oh, we can't, use the fire. But if somebody said, oh, let's go for a rip on the ATV, you wouldn't think, oh, that could cause a fire. That is a regular occurrence in the Alberta fire stats. So, she's got the stats to back her up. Unfortunately, just like Guilbeault and cleaning up the electricity grid, she's up against a religious fervor that says this is going to be climate change. Host a podcast called Full Comment for my employer. And I interviewed a gentleman named Ken Green from the Fraser Institute. And he says, yeah, climate change is real. Climate change is happening. There's a bit of a base increase that will contribute to a degree towards forest fires, but there's no concrete proof that this year it's bad because of climate change.
After the break, a pro-life group speaks up against a Calgary bylaw amendment that provides guidelines to graphic images on anti-abortion materials. Welcome back. A new city bylaw in Calgary has sparked controversy among the pro-life movement in Alberta. The law introduced new guidelines on anti-abortion material for distribution, including graphic images. Richard Durr, the executive director of Pro-Life Alberta, sat down with Jeanette Roche to speak on the subject. They also discussed the discrepancy with why some believe bodily autonomy is important when it comes to pro-choice matters, but not to mandatory vaccination.
Calgary City Council's decision to pass a bylaw amendment requires images depicting photos of abortions to be concealed within an opaque envelope with a warning about its contents. So since you're the executive director of Pro-Life Alberta, what's your take on this?
Well, I think that if the photos are too graphic for public consumption, then perhaps the act of abortion, which brings about these horrific images in the first place, is what ought to be prohibited.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so was your organization one of the ones delivering this material?
Pro-Life Alberta doesn't normally distribute abortion victim photography, but abortions in Alberta are publicly funded. So I think it's important that Albertans see what our tax dollars are paying for.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't these flyers available to really anyone who opens their mailbox, even children?
So in Alberta, I think it is important that for Albertans of all ages to understand the reality of abortion, because minors do not require the consent of their parents to get an abortion in Alberta. And so I think it's important, again, for Albertans of all ages to understand the reality of abortion because of that very fact. The goal, in large part, too, as I understand it, is to prevent and to save the mother from a lifetime of regret and heartache, and to save her preborn child from the death through abortion. That's the goal of these images.
How did other pro-choice and pro-life advocacy groups respond to the bylaw amendment passed by City Council in Calgary last month?
I mean, there's many people see it as City Council should stay in its lane. That in Calgary, it seems that the council is focused on, rather than focused on safety at on our C trains and in public transit, it's focused on matters that seem very much outside its purview and outside its scope of responsibilities.
Okay. Do you understand the rationale for the City Council doing this?
Well, I can understand how people are troubled and disturbed. Any right-thinking person is disturbed at seeing the images of an abortion, and rightly so. I mean, it is a very disturbing thing. But again, if the photos are too graphic for public consumption, then the act of abortion, which brings about these horrific images in the first place, is the thing that should be prohibited. That's the thing that should be regulated and outlawed, not these images, which just seeing is believing, which demonstrate and show the truth and ugly reality of abortion.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so what specific measures will be implemented to enforce this new bylaw amendment, and what penalties will be imposed on those who violate these regulations?
As I understand it, there's fines involved. I think for more kind of specifics surrounding the penalties, you'd have to ask the town councillors or the city councillors.
I know, like, it's particularly during the COVID pandemic, there was an interesting argument brought about regarding COVID vaccine mandates and then pro-choice people and how there might be that discrepancy. So in your mind, is there a discrepancy between people who are pro-vaccine mandate and pro-choice, given that both issues involve personal autonomy and bodily integrity?
Right. Yeah, and I think it merits thoughtful reflection. And one of the things about these images is that they evoke reflection, oftentimes not thoughtful, perhaps, but they do evoke reflection and public debate and all the rest of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why they are so important and essential, even in a free and democratic society where things ought to be debated. And so oftentimes the views that we are opposed to are unfairly or unduly censored, and that then prohibits an open and free discussion, which again is essential.
You know, we can't plant land in the ground and expect to grow more land. As a result, proper stewardship of our land is key. After the break, a discussion on the importance of land conservation.